I take your view to be they're reflecting the divine. As Schopenhauer would put it, Schopenhauer's view of aesthetics was that when we're having an aesthetic experience, it taps into the rhythm of what he called the will. So you're tapping into the form of aesthetic beauty, which I think your view is sort of similar to there in terms of scripture. There's certainly parallels, at least. But what I think's interesting from a philosophical point of view is, and I think for people more generally, is whether these events are concrete in the sense that they're historical events, and second, whether or not you do take this God to be a perfect being, like the God of Anselm, the God of Aquinas, the God of Augustine, like the classical conception of God. Because I think there are a lot of Christians out there at the moment that are holding you up and saying, look, Christianity's back. Here's Jordan Peterson saying he's a Christian. And here's him talking about scripture. Like, new atheism's dead. And here we are with the resurrection of Christianity. But I don't think you're the type of Christian which they have traditionally had in mind, for sure. My colleague at Durham University, Philip Goff, he's either coming out, or maybe I'm going to be coming out for him here, as a heretical Christian. And he thinks you don't have to believe in a perfect God, and you don't have to believe that the Christ event was a real event in order to be a Christian. There is a middle way between God and atheism. And that's my view as an agnostic as well. There is a middle way. It's just different to perhaps yours and Philip Goff's. And I wonder, like, would you be happy to be characterized in that middle ground, in finding new radical solutions to what's been a very partisan debate between theists and atheists?
Well, I don't think that characterization is quite accurate, although I think not in its details, but I think perhaps there's elements of the gist that are accurate. I mean, I suppose, you could say philosophically that I'm an existential Christian. Maybe that's a reasonable way of putting it, in that I think that I believe that the Judeo-Christian ethos is not an ethos of what would you say, of propositional belief. The propositional belief is a surface, and it's necessary, but only insofar as it's in accordance with something deeper. Just like your words should be in accordance with your actions, but your actions are the fundament. Now, the words shouldn't contradict that. And I'm not saying that words are trivial, because they're not, but the commitment to faith that's demanded by Christianity is an existential commitment. And what that means, it's an all-in commitment. And that's a definition. I mean, Christianity is actually an outline of an all-in commitment. It's a representation of that. And so now, with regards to God being perfect, well, in some sense, for me, that's a moot point in a way, partly because with this Jacob's Ladder conception, it's enough for me to know that no matter how high I continue to climb, there won't be an upper limit. And I mean, hell has been characterized as a bottomless pit. And part of the reason for that existentially is because things, no matter how bad things get, and they can get very, very bad, you can make them worse. There's something you can do to make them worse. But I also think that that's true on the positive side, which is that if you follow your calling, let's say, and abide by your conscience, there's no limit to the upward trek. And I guess I would say that we've conceptualized belief improperly in our culture, and because of that, we're caught on a dilemma between the Enlightenment rationalists and the Christians, because we have a propositional dispute. But I would say, let's talk about calling for a minute. So,
can I just come in on that?
Please.
Because these are three fascinating points. I think we're into the detail and where things are perhaps different between your views and let's call them the analytic philosophers of religion, the people who are in the universities thinking about this question in detail. I think there are three things there, right? The first is that you said there that you can climb Jacob's ladder, but you'll go on forever, like you'll never reach it. And there are two ways of interpreting, I think, that statement. The one is that you, Jordan Peterson, and me, Jack Symes, can climb the ladder towards intrinsic goods, but perhaps will never reach what we might consider perfection, i.e. reaching the fulfillment of goodness, knowledge, power. We'll always be striving. But I don't think you can make a second claim, which would be that the ladder itself goes on forever, because ultimately I think you need something to ground or hang up those values onto. You need an intrinsic good at the end, a fulfillment of what is taken to be good. So I think those two
and
things
you
can
need one
be
that's
consistent.
understandable.
I completely agree. You need one understandable. But in terms of your the idea of God as perfection, again, this is just a side point of information. What's interesting is that Eugen Nagasawa and Catherine Rogers, two brilliant philosophers of religion, have claimed there has never been a philosopher of religion who has argued for anything less than a perfectly good God. And that's phenomenal. That's changing. As I mentioned a second ago, maybe Goff fits into this view with a God of limited powers, or the God which, to go back to our earlier part of the discussion, a God whose consciousness underlies our world but is constrained by the laws of physics, let's say. There is a greater being than that, and it's a being that's not confined to the laws of physics. So we're in a really interesting part of philosophy and religion at the moment in our culture where that's changing. But the third point, and I think this distinction shows the difference perhaps between your thinking and my thinking on this, is that let's take that statement, I believe in God. For me, that can be taken in two ways, the focus being on belief. Either I believe in God like I believe in humanity. When I say that, I don't mean like there's a thing called humanity. I mean, there's a thing which I'm putting my hope in. There's something that I trust, i.e. humanity. But obviously there's a second way of taking that statement, which is I believe that this thing exists, like the concept of humanity or God. And so when you say you're an existentialist believer in God, I think you probably fall into that first category, that you take the leap of faith towards God. You trust God. You put your belief in God in that way, rather than making the propositional claim, there is some concrete entity that is satisfied and is true and described in the proposition there as a perfect being who's conscious, powerful, good, and the like. Do you think that's a fair characterization of the distinction?
Well, I have a hard time understanding exactly how to get to the second without thoroughly dispensing with the first, or thoroughly arranging the first properly. So let me respond to that in a way that also addresses another issue that you brought up. So you said with regards to Jacob's ladder, and I described this like infinite upward climb, let's say, at least of human beings. You said, well, there has to be something at the top. So let me describe for a moment how I think that's dealt with, at least in part, in the combined Old Testament and New Testament canons. And I'll make reference, I think, primarily to the concept of the Logos. So there's an insistence in Christianity that, and Christ himself makes this claim, that he's the embodiment of the prophet and the laws. And this is it's a very interesting claim technically, because what you have in the Old Testament, and you already alluded to this, is a series of characterizations of God. Like it's not all the Old Testament is, but the narrative part of it is a sequence of characterizations of God. It's sort of like there's a human being in this situation, and this is what God appears like to him or her. And then there's a human being in this situation, and this is how God appears to him or her. And so the God of the Tower of Babel is characterized in a different manner than the God in the story of the flood. There's an underlying insistence that these are all manifestations of the same transcendent reality, but the characterizations differ. Now, there's a pattern across those characterizations. Now, Christ's claim is that he's the physical embodiment of that pattern. And it's an extremely interesting claim. I have a very difficult time dispensing with it, let's say, on rational grounds. And this is an answer to the definition of what's at the pinnacle, at least insofar as that might be comprehensible by human beings. Because Christ, like Job, is the mortal man who says yes to existence in the most radical possible manner. And so you to understand that, you have to take apart, in some sense, what that radical acceptance would mean if it was truly radical. And what it would mean is something like what was initially outlined in the story of Job. So Job is a good man by God's own testimony, and God essentially turns him over to the powers of evil so that they can have their way with him. And there's historical precedent for that idea, because Cain invites in Lucifer to have his way with him. This is something that happens in the Old Testament. canon. But in the case of Job, Job doesn't invite Satan in. God basically sicks Satan on him. And then everything that can possibly happen that's terrible to a person happens to Job.